Good morning and welcome to the Economist panel, the Phoenix Center 2016 Annual Telecoms Symposium. This is a traditional event, a traditional panel. I'm not sure how wise, Larry, it is to start off with Economist.
You're so engaging. Everybody wants to hear Economist.
But we'll do our best to break a smile and perhaps
No math.
no math, and hopefully we'll do our best to find a little humor. This morning, the panel is going to address promoting broadband investment in the 21st century. The format for the panel differs a little bit from that of our previous symposia, where each panelist made a formal presentation on a specific economic aspect of the general topic addressed by the panel, followed by a few questions. This year, the panelists will not be making formal presentations. Rather, I will be posing a series of questions to the panelists concerning the economics and policy related to the promotion of broadband investment. Panelists are also welcome to ask questions of each other, in addition to what I might suggest. If time allows, we'll take a few questions from the audience toward the end of the panel. We're very pleased this morning to have a very experienced and highly knowledgeable telecommunications expert economist who are well known in the Washington Telecoms policy community. Sitting in the center is Dr. Timothy Brennan, who is professor of public policy and economics in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County campus, and a recent former chief economist at the Federal Communications Commission. Sitting on the far end is Dr. John Mayo, who is currently professor of economics, business, and public policy in the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. And finally, sitting closest to me is Dr. George Ford, who is chief economist at the Phoenix Center and former chief economist at Telecommunications, and a former senior economist in the Office of Policy and Strategic Planning at the former MCI WorldCom Corporation. Just an important disclaimer: the views expressed by a panelist reflect their own views and may not necessarily reflect the views of their sponsors and employers, and in my own case, any views that I might express, including any questions I might ask, reflect my own personal views and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Federal Communications Commission, its commissioners, or members of the Commission's staff. Have I left any disclaimer out before we get started? Okay. I'm not even a lawyer. We're going to start right off with a question that ought to stimulate some thought. First question, and the first one to jump at it can have it, and then followed by any other response. If you could, through some magic, introduce a single economic concept that the Commission would consistently apply in its analysis of policy issues, what would that concept be?
Can I have two quick ones?
Mm-hmm.
The first would be, it's a little contradictory here, is that if the reason you want to adopt something is not economics based, don't pretend that it is. That just messes everything up in terms of trying to figure out what's really going on. And the other one would be, if you're going to endorse economics, be kind of serious about it. I remember being struck at the latest TPRC. I was sitting with George and Larry, and Commissioner Riley was speaking. He said we ought to have more benefit cost analysis at the FCC, and then he cited the one instance where they do that, which involves safety regulation, and then trashed it. You know, that, oh, what's this silly value statistical life stuff? I mean, that's nonsense. well, if you want to do benefit cost analysis, do it and live with the consequences. I'm not necessarily defending that particular application, that particular decision. It was a complicated one. But you can't have your cake and eat it too.
Okay?
George, go ahead, John. So, first, I agree with both points Tim just raised, but let me say that when I heard the question, I sort of think of this as a hammer and nail situation where I'm a hammer and everything I look at, it looks like a nail. My background is industrial organization economics, which studies the emergence and suppression of competition. It's a long, venerable area of study. In our particular case, I think it would be just wonderful if the FCC would consistently adhere to a notion of competition, to take seriously a definition of competition and to apply that definition of competition. It's important. Competition has been central to telecommunications policy for, let's call it 100 years. And it isn't just an old notion, it's a new notion, and it affects public policy on an ongoing basis. Just in the last couple of years, a fear of competition led to, or a lack of, fear of a lack of competition led to the open internet order. A fear of a lack of competition led to a movement away from an unfettered auction in spectrum markets, in the incentive auctions. On an ongoing basis, annually, the FCC is charged with assessing the state of competition in mobile telephony, in local wireline telephony, and the multi-channel video programming distribution markets. In all of those cases, we have a sort of mercurial and amorphous application of the notion of competition. Just to give one sense of this, in the case of cable telephony, where the FCC is required to define and render a judgment about effective competition. Alternatively, over the last several years, the FCC has said that effective competition is alternatively the presence of 3 firms in the marketplace, or at different times 6 firms in the marketplace, or at a different time 2 firms in the marketplace. And those number of firms could be applied with a market share filter or not a market share filter, where the market share filter might be the largest firm in the market, or it could be the smallest firm in the market. So there's just been a lot of movement in the cable arena in terms of the application of that concept of competition. The same thing is true if you follow the evolution of the declaration or lack of declaration of the notion of competition in mobile telephony, where we have never had a definition applied, but the FCC has at different times alternatively rendered a judgment about the presence of effective competition or not. So all that said, I think it would be delightful if the FCC were to go back to the roots of the notion of effective competition. Self-promotion, a colleague of mine, Amanda Delp at Georgetown, and I have written a paper on the evolution of the concept of competition and offer a sort of a modern notion of that concept that I think would be consistent and applicable moving forward. So just having that consistent definition application would be terrific.
George?
The evolution of effective competition at the FCC, where competition evolves as the solution demands it. I would extend a little bit what John is saying, and I agree completely with Tim. I'll give you an example from my own experience in that. I would want the commission to use the concept, two-stage model of competition, where the number of competitors is determined jointly with the price. We talk a lot about competition. We count firms a lot. In fact, we've to some extent walking away from price regulation and towards pro-competition policy, but the FCC has no model of how the number of firms is determined. It never talks about that. I mean, it does in some cases. It talks about scale economies. It'll talk about some cost. but it never gets around to saying that in this market, 3 may be in equilibrium, and wanting 5 is a waste of time if 3 is all you can have. And I think policy has very little influence on expanding. I think policy can create monopolies. I think policy has a harder time creating 4 firms or 5 firms out of 3. And that's, it's an interesting question to ask. Is 4 national wireless providers a sustainable equilibrium when 2 of them have struggled financially for a number of years? Or should it be 3? And if it is 3, do you have the courage to allow a merger from 4 to 3? But that idea, I think, will greatly clear up a lot of confusion that the FCC and its orders have on competition and the promotion of competition, because you can't promote competition beyond the limits that economics puts on the number of competitors, and I think Tim would like to respond.
I just want to qualify, I guess, dissent may be too strong a word. Whenever I heard Chairman Wheeler say that his mantra was competition, 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 all I could think of was antitrust division, antitrust division, antitrust division. Antitrust division where I had my first job, and even though I haven't been there full time for 30 years, I still use the word we, referring to the antitrust division with some pride. It seems like, I'm not a business school type here like John, but it seems like that anybody ought to be differentiating their product, not trying to duplicate it. Part of the reason I started off by saying if the rationale for something is in economics, you should be clear about that and then try to defend it on those grounds, which is, I think, a non-trivial process and one that's been kind of neglected. That if something really is competition related, maybe the antitrust division should be dealing with the kind of things George was talking about they're doing with a wireless merger, for example. Maybe the failing firm defense is more relevant or something along those lines. I'm not sure that the FCC's best role is to be yet another competition agency. There's a lot of discussion about, do you need 2 agencies evaluating mergers if the only issue is a competitive one, for example. And I'm not sure that you do. And if the FCC really can't defend itself on grounds other than as a competition promoter, maybe it should get out of business.
Well, if you dissent again, I'm going to ask you to step down. I would dissent.
Coffee's not bad.
Muffins are more. They just delivered me muffins. I would dissent slightly in part 2, and this is a bit loose, but I will put it this way. The antitrust agencies can't count below 4. You might have to think about that for a minute. But I have a hard time. I think that FCC has a role to play, because I think that they started with the natural monopolies, of course, almost everywhere. And now we've been able to get some duopoly here and some, 3 or 4 firms in various other places. But the numbers are always small. And I don't think that the Department of Justice, and I don't know so much about the FTC because the DOJ normally deals with telecom issues, I don't know if they're capable of really thinking in terms of going from 4 to 3 is okay. I just think they have a natural tendency to say no. And I think the FCC, as an expert agency, could look at the market and say, well, now I think that's the best way to allocate spectrum and to manage the spectrum, and I think the outcome is going to be as good as it can be, and that we just can't sustain 4. I think the DOJ might reject a merger like that. I think the FCC might say yes, and the FCC would override the decision of the Department of Justice. We've already litigated that case, and the FCC had the top authority in that dispute.
For fear of being thrown off the stage, I won't use the word dissent. I'll just say I'm going to interject a couple ideas. A couple of things. One is that if the discipline of economics teaches us anything, it is that competition effective competition, in my mind, isn't necessarily a function of the number of firms at all. And it is a function of the rivalry exhibited by the firms in the marketplace and the rivalry that firms outside the market might impose as a disciplinary force on firms in the market. So the notion of counting to a particular number is right away something that is a bit antithetical to the roots of economics. You're right, George, it does exist, and from my perspective, that's really too bad. A little bit of a nuanced difference, though, I would say, is between the Department of Justice and the FCC is that in evaluating mergers, the change in the level of competition is important and can be tied in some circumstances to a change in the number of firms. What you're talking about is an equilibrium set of firms that I think raises a different standard altogether than the ones used by the DOJ. So there's just a little bit of a difference there. And the second thing I want to just say with respect to what Tim brings up is I think a very important and profound challenge for us moving forward, and that is who really ought to be thinking about competition in the telecommunications space. Is it, or have we moved to a point where we can move beyond sector-specific considerations of competition and simply allow for the expert antitrust agencies to oversee the rendering of judgments regarding competition? And I think it's a debate that maybe will unfold over the next few years.
I might just interject a historical note. Going back to the late 1960s and into the 1970s at the Commission, the idea of what constituted competition was very ill-defined because essentially at that time the Commission was dealing with monopoly markets, at least in most sectors, be it terminal equipment, long-distance services, and certainly local services. At the time, the implicit view was the number of desired participants was essentially endogenous because at the time, I don't think anybody had a clue whether if you opened up the private line market or the long distance market, just how many players could survive. So the focal point, and again the reason I mention this might be a practice that is worth considering again, was very much on the conditions of entry. That is to say, what were the barriers that prevented entry? Was there asymmetric treatment from a regulatory point of view toward the incumbents versus the entrants, particularly as to the kind of regulation they were subjected to? So that might be approach, comment on what I'm saying here would be useful, that instead of counting noses and making some pronouncements about competition, that the focal point should return to just concentrating on conditions of entry, and then the number of firms that survive is in fact the equilibrium number of firms that cost conditions and demand conditions would support, and would pull away from trying to have some target number of participants as a goal. One other note, I think as we talk about role of competition policy, it's important to remember that the statutory standard for making decisions at the Commission differs from the Department of Justice. The public interest standard certainly includes competition and Clayton Act considerations, but it's considerably more expansive in what it considers to be in the public interest. So I think it may be a hard putt to separate competition analysis from those considerations and simply say the commission doesn't do competition analysis. It's something that DOJ does. I think it's very hard to do that when your standard of review is so broad. For example, in broadcast policy, goals that would not be considered by an antitrust agency are considered by the commission, such as diversity and such non-competition relation policy matters. So anyway, two thoughts. Maybe panelists might want to pick up on one or both. Or not at all.
I would simply add that while entry is important and entry conditions are important, the existence of or absence of rivalry among the firms that are in the market is critical in this industry. We have seen, and just this is something that we all see every day, a massive amount of rivalry among the various wireless carriers, among the broadband providers in terms of trying to solicit customer patronage away from the other firms. And that too is a really critical part of competition.
Well, I think that raises the issue that we tend, not so much economists, but I think maybe non-economists, is what are the relevant dimensions of competition that really should matter? That is, price is the textbook focal point, but we know in real life that price may be entirely secondary to competition in quality, or competition in product diversity, or competition in an innovative aspect of the product or service, where price really begins to be pushed to some extent to the side. How should this be reflected in doing a competitive analysis in the markets that we regulate?
I was going to say, I appreciate Jerry's broadcasting example. I think that's a good case in point. I can easily imagine, and it's probably happened, that the Justice Department would decide not to block a merger of some communications outlets, but the FCC might decide to block it on diversity grounds. And I don't have any problem in principle with that. I mean, I do have some problems not with the idea, but I've got a problem with, and I've mentioned this to John before, that with the idea that we don't have a framework for talking about those kinds of things the way we do with antitrust. What are the theories? What are the evidence that would support these sorts of things for these other kinds of standards, as opposed to just someone saying, gee, wouldn't it be nice, or something like that. And I do think that's a problem, but I just think it's unfortunate that the FCC seems to have adopted a view, and not alone in this, that the only problems in the world are antitrust problems. And I think that's not good. And in light of what George has said, I will, even though I haven't been there for a long time, I will defend to the day the expertise of certainly the economists at the antitrust agencies. I can guarantee you they do not sit there, count firms, and decide, oh, what the hell, we're not going to block it, or we'll block everything that's 4-3 or something like that. Having seen some of the merger simulation work they do close up, that's just so far from what it is they really do.
Let me just maybe amplify something that Tim just picked up on, and that is that if you're going to have a statutory requirement of pursuing the goal of the public interest, it would be really nice to be able to define what that meant in very practical terms, or at least to nail down a little bit what that means. And the reason that it's nice is that if you go back and look historically at the evolution of regulation and deregulation in this country, the major regulatory and major deregulatory measures that have been adopted in this country over the last 50 years have been adopted at the very moment that ideologically people want government either in or out of their lives, which suggests that you're getting regulatory or deregulatory decisions based purely on the ideological whim of the people at the moment in time that the decision's being made. That doesn't bode well for regulation, because it means that you're going to get industries that are swept up in regulation that should be deregulated, and you're going to get industries that are deregulated that should be regulated at any point in time, as opposed to using some set of standards and principles. So I'll just echo what Tim said in that regard.
I think that the public interest does have a great deal of legal history and legal precedent. Larry has written a good paper on that. It's just nobody pays attention to it. And right now we are operating in a world where precedent is completely irrelevant. Every regulatory decision is a bargain, combining multiple things, so that each decision is unique. It has no precedent. It has no precedent. And I think certainly over the last few years, what prior courts have said has played almost no role in the decisions. I don't even know what a good definition really does. Maybe that should have been the thing that we made the commission do, is actually adhere to a definition of precedent. And I do think, and on Tim's point about the FTC, one is, I mean, not the FTC, but if you look at the Department of Justice and you read their analysis of the AT&T T-Mobile merger, it looked like some first course, industrial organization analysis of headcounts and how they use the HHI to decide a merger. It was no more sophisticated than that. So I don't know about the Federal Trade Commission, they didn't review the case. But I do think in a merger simulation, that what a merger simulation does is cause price to go up. They all do that. It's inherent to the model. Unless you've got 1,000 firms or something. And even then, if you go to 999, the price is going to go up a little bit. And it's sort of this trade-off between efficiencies and price increases. If you have an equilibrium of 3 firms, and because of regulatory artifacts you have 4, and you need to go from 4 to 3, what's going to happen? Price is going to go up. Price has to go up. Okay? It's just moving from a disequilibrium to a sustainable equilibrium. Price is going to go up. The antitrust authority is going to have to fit. Their models are going to say price is going to go up. Now you may be able to introduce, like we did in one of our papers, the efficiency you get in spectrum, so that you actually get a efficiency to offset that price effect. But I've never seen, and you can correct me, any of these people think, and except in a failing firm defense, which no one will ever make, because that's a disaster, unless it's really bad, and not in telecoms, because that's a disaster for your stock price to say, I've got to bid. I mean, look at Sirius XM, they didn't even make a failing firm defense, although everybody kind of knew that's what they were making. So I don't know. I still think that the FCC has to deal with monopoly, duopoly, triopolies, and that's a game that the antitrust agencies just have a hard time playing. Disagree?
Yes, I disagree with you.
Okay. And he's worked at the FTC, so take that seriously.
Okay, let's move on to a somewhat different question. It brings us a little closer to the topic of the panel. We're seeing more and more acquisitions of content by broadband service providers. Comcast purchased UMBC Universal, Verizon acquired AOL, and is buying Yahoo. AT&T has proposed a merger with Time Warner. Why is this happening? And what's the long-term consequences of this change in industrial organization?
Well, I suspect there are thousands of reasons why it's happening. There's always just the content is king mentality. But you've seen, in part because of SEC decisions, the commodification of broadband networks. Essentially, not too far from now, it'd be completely interchangeable. and it just won't matter. You buy connectivity, this homogeneous product called connectivity. It's very difficult to make money in that kind of business. And it's certainly very difficult to justify multi-billion-dollar investment levels every year if you're selling a commodity product. And so the companies are attempting to diversify and to become different, have different products. And to also, I think, we wrote a paper on this, that network neutrality could drive the vertical integration. The main argument for network neutrality is to keep the network core from obtaining any of the economic gains from the network's edge, which would happen in any market. If one segment of a market is doing well, then all segments of the market will generally do well, will share in that new wealth. But network neutrality is an attempt to keep the network from sharing in the wealth created at the edge. That's essentially what you can break it down to. And just because the FCC says, no, I'm not going to let you participate in that through the price system, which means I'm going to charge you to terminate on my network, doesn't mean that that wealth isn't there and somebody wants to have it, and that there's some complementary relationship. So the alternative to pricing it out is to vertically integrate into it. So I think that the rules in part, and maybe a small, are driving it. But the market is evolving to the commodification of networks, and that's not sustainable for a multi-billion-dollar network.
Go ahead. So, the world's getting more complicated, and when it gets more complicated, I try to think more simply. So I'm going to just identify 3 reasons. George said there are a million, a zillion, maybe, but I'm going to go to 3 that are pretty profound or pretty simple and straightforward. Number 1, firms want to grow. All firms want to grow. And if you look at the traditional telecommunications companies right now, the wireline space isn't really growing. The wireless space is growing less rapidly than it once was. And it's likely to be the case that the traditional providers are looking around and saying, what's the best growth opportunity for us? Content in that context makes sense. It's not like going out and buying Ringling Brothers Farm and Bailey Circus. It's something that they might very well be pretty good at, given that they own the wires already, and that there might be arguably some economies of scope between those particular products. So number 1, I think they're looking for ways to grow, and it's a pretty natural way to think about growth. Number 2, if you look at the firms that traditional telecom providers think of as their rivals, as their competitors, they're largely the darling firms of the modern economy, of Google and Facebook and Netflix. And you have to ask yourself, what are those companies doing? Those companies are all getting into the delivery of the sort of ownership of content and the desire to get content in front of eyeballs. And so there's, I think, a natural strategic reaction on the part of telecom companies to just simply not want to be outflanked by the firms that they see as their rivals. And so I think that's a very natural thing. And it also is the case that it makes sense, as I said, maybe because they own the wires, but it also makes sense that if you look at the future of consumers who may not be on a wireline network, they may be cutting the cord increasingly, then it really helps diversify the downside risk of owning those wires. And then I think the third reason, the final reason is one that if you look at content, it is the very expensive part of the delivery of media to consumers. By getting into content, I think the traditional telecom providers gain some leverage, some bargaining position to reduce the price of content, to increase their bargaining position, and to reduce those prices. To an economist, this is nothing more than what we refer to as the double marginalization problem. that you'd like to be vertically integrated because you don't want to see the price of a commodity at the upstream stage then passed along to consumers at the next stage, closer to retail consumers, who are then, the provider is then marking it up again, in which case you get an inefficiency from society's perspective. Consumers lose because prices are too high, so you really start to eliminate that double marginalization problem. So I think those are three.
Just say very quickly, first, perhaps unlike the last time, I agree with George on the net neutrality observation. I think a predictable outcome of price control is vertical integration discrimination. Broke up the phone company 30 odd years ago for that reason. A lot of electricity policy is in response to that concern. So I think that's there. And I also appreciate what John said about double marginalization. But the rest of it, I'm glad that Jerry asked the question, because to be honest, I don't get it. So John said firms want to grow. I don't see in Econ 101 anything about firms' growth. There's an optimal size of firms that maximize their profits. Bingo. You know, maybe managers want to grow, but is that a sign of efficiency? Is that a sign that managers are out of the control of their stockholders and they just are into, you know, maybe for a bigger company we get a bigger private plane or something? Which may not be a good thing. I just don't get it. In terms of diversification for hedging, you know, any portfolio manager can do that for you. You don't have to vertically integrate in order to do that. And this idea about, you know, well, they're competing with Google or something. Well, maybe it's something. I remember a long time ago, somebody, this is to show you how long ago, this is somebody defending the Bell Atlantic NYNEX merger, put up their combined market capitalization to Microsoft's, which was much bigger at the time, and said, well, look, and I go, yeah, so what? You know, I mean, Microsoft's in one market, they're in another, and so there's this, you know, we've got to be like them, we've got to be, you know, involved in all these things, that there's some motivation going on that I frankly don't understand. So I was really glad to hear John talk about this. Why, you know, I teach in a public policy school and John teaches in business school. He understands these kind of things and I don't.
Well, to be clear, the question was why are they doing this, not what's optimal. And I think that's the sense that, from Tim's perspective, I think you're saying, I don't get it in the sense that that there may be other ways to accomplish diversification, for example, other than buying firms in the content arena. Completely agree. It's possible to do that, but I do think, in terms of answering the question, why are they doing this? I think I pretty well hit the nail on the head. Again, back to my hammer.
Okay, I think we settled that question pretty definitively. Economists view investment in broadband facilities essentially as an input. This is worth reflecting on for a moment. Broadband and public policy discussions focus very much on advancing investment in broadband. That's the theme of this particular panel. But it's worth thinking for a moment that broadband really is, to a consumer, an intermediate good. In fact, it has no value in and of itself if it didn't serve as a conduit to any number of applications. Consumers would have no economic interest in having a big fat transmission pipe into their home, or for that matter, for a business. However, that gets pushed aside a bit when we talk about public policy improving or advancing the amount and type of investment in broadband facilities. We economists often try to help in evaluating the social desirability of resource allocation decisions, including investment. That is, we use the word optimality in various contexts, but presumably we tried to say more than more is always preferable to less. The only exception that I know of is amongst guitar players, where having one more guitar is always preferable to less. But I doubt if that's truly socially optimal. So the question I have for you is, what sort of metrics should we economists bring to the question of investing in broadband infrastructure to guide policymakers in making decisions about how to promote investment? Is there such a thing as too much broadband? We seem to think there's too little, but could there be too much? And if we're going to address that question, what metrics would we use to advise policymakers when we have reached some optimal?
I think that's an interesting question, a good one. In my recent paper on municipal broadband, I go through this discussion a little bit on broadband and why we always feel like we don't have enough or we're behind or whatever. And whether it's true or not, from an economic standpoint, there's this idea that broadband has this externality attached to it. That there are all these positive things that happen. And the thing about externalities is that they're not captured by the firm that makes broadband, and a lot of times not captured directly by the people that buy broadband. There's a third-party effect. And what this does is it drives a wedge between what the private sector will do and what society wants done. And that wedge always exists, but the externality adds this additional dimension to it. And so we're always, by assigning this extremely high value to broadband, we can then create this situation where there's a gap between what we have and what we want. And that's the source of much consternation and much policy. Some of it good, some of it bad. But we have to recognize, I think, that the private sector alone, if you buy this externality argument, and I think all public policymakers do, that private investment alone will never satisfy, ever satisfy. And I think that's something you have to admit to, okay? And I think this kind of goes to what Tim was saying earlier. And then you have to ask the question, how big is this externality and how much should the government be pouring into this industry? If you look at the National Broadband Plan, for example, they did a cost model, and some houses would cost you $50,000, $100,000, $200,000 to provide broadband to. Could that possibly be worth it? And an economist ought to sit down and figure out whether it's worth $50,000, or would it make more sense to put the house on the back of a truck and move it into town where it could get a connection. I mean, it's something, I imagine that a lot of people who don't have broadband, you can say, here's $20,000, okay? Are you okay not having broadband? I give you $20,000. And I imagine many of them would say, yeah, I'll take the 20 grand. And it'd be probably half of what it costs to get broadband. So I think that's the one thing the National Broadband Plan should have answered and didn't, and it's probably politically why they couldn't, is what is it worth? Okay, because we create a big model about what it costs. Now what is it worth, and does the worth justify the cost? And until you get to that, I think we're always going to be confused. And we're going to be confused in these 706 reports, although I think they're purely politically motivated for this decision. But is broadband being deployed adequately? And I think the question is, well, is it adequately by the standard of the private sector or adequately by the standard of the public sector? If there's externalities involved, and the FCC believes there's externalities involved, and it's not enough, then whose fault is that? That blame goes to the government, not to the private sector. Okay? And regulating the private sector isn't going to fill that gap. Okay? You don't fill the externality gap by regulating the profits of the people trying to provide the service. You subsidize it. You make it more profitable, not less profitable.
Just very quickly, I agree with
George's sort of framework for this, which is, I have no idea what the right amount of investment is. To me, the idea is you fix market failures, you fix government failures, and then it is what it is. You know, but I mean, that's easily, obviously, for reasons George pointed out, it's more easily said than done. The one thing I would be somewhat specific on, that sort of puzzles me, is that from what I can recall, I think the rationale for 25 megs down was so all 4 members of a household could watch a high-definition Netflix movie at the same time. I'm not entirely sure that if we're defending this by things like education and civic participation and access to e-government and that sort of stuff, that that's really necessary. And so the idea that if one could, you know, save a lot of money by maybe not having, you know, someone's version of some ideal level of broadband service, that might be a real help.
So the question was, what are the metrics that we ought to use? And I agree with both George and Tim in their remarks, but let me zero in on metrics. Historically, we've used 2. One is the deployment of broadband, and secondly, the adoption of broadband. In terms of deployment, the private sector has done a pretty yeoman's-like job of getting broadband out there, from my perspective. We've got 90% of American households are connected to broadband. If you use the 25 down, 3 up standard. If you use the standard of 10 down and 1 up, which is only a few years old, it's basically 100% of the nation has access to broadband today, and that is so different than it was just a decade ago. So that's I think important to just put that marker in the ground. In terms of adoption, which is sort of the next wave of policy considerations, I agree with both George and Tim that it's really difficult to say what's the optimal number. What's the optimal amount? Let me put a couple of caveats on it. Well, what we know in terms of the metric is that about 2/3 of households have adopted wireline broadband service. If you roll in cell phones, it's about 80%, or smartphones, it's about 80% have either broadband, wireline, or smartphones. So is there some headroom? Yes, there's some headroom. Difference between 80 and 100 is 20%. And might we want to get there? The caveats that I put on this, and the pause that I'd suggest at this moment, is to ask ourselves the question, how paternalistic do we want to be? How paternalistic do we want to be? If we were thinking about the adoption of blue jeans or furniture in your sofa in your home, no one would suggest that we should be at 100%. That we let those decisions be made by individuals of their own volition. Now, arguably, because of what George suggested in terms of the externalities that may be involved, broadband is a little special. That broadband creates the possibility of a sense of community that might be lacking but for broadband. It creates access to information that can change education levels. It can change healthcare behaviors and outcomes. We have some research that we're just doing on that and finding some really positive things. There's all sorts of reasons why you might want to move beyond just simply being completely non-paternalistic in this space. But then the second caveat comes in, and the second caveat is, if we want to increase broadband adoption, let's be smart about it. We can have soft hearts, but let's at least have some hard heads about this. We know that what we know is that people tell us that factor A and B and C cause them not to have adopt broadband. Things like price, the lack of computer equipment, or lack of digital literacy, or I simply don't want it. So we know what people say, but we know precious little about what actually causes people to adopt or not to adopt broadband. If you actually give them choices. The FCC went through a series of 14 trials, experiments, where various factors that we believe might affect broadband, price, digital literacy, access to computer equipment, might be, they were tweaked and adjusted, prices were adjusted down, digital literacy was offered, computers were subsidized, and what those 14 experiments found is we don't know a lot. It was really, really hard to get people who are not on broadband hooked up to broadband. So I think the caveat is that we need to maybe pause, find out, and this is a charge for the FCC and the economics community, to find out what really are the levers that will work in increasing that broadband adoption.
I suspect Pokemon Go had more effect on broadband adoption than anything else. I think on the broadband deployment thing, you look at the market now and you think, has the private sector done its job? And you look at Google, and Google comes in, builds a few networks, promises to build a lot more, and now it's stopped. And basically said we're out of this business of deploying fiber optics, which is telling you something. I mean, here's an entity with lots of cash and who can monetize a broadband connection with the best of them. And it has decided, I'm going to invest my time in balloons and satellites or some other way to provide broadband service. And there's a lot of other companies that are playing in that. Facebook is playing with balloons, I think, now too. Blimps or whatever. And we've got a couple of satellite companies, low Earth orbit satellite companies looking at it. So I think when you look, and then of course there's municipal broadband, which means I've got to now pour in massive amounts of tax dollars to keep these things sustained. So that tells me that from a private sector perspective, we've sort of done what is doable. And if you're unhappy with the way things are, then you need to start looking at how big is this externality problem, and am I being reasonable about being unhappy with what's going on, and what is the size of that thing. And that's just something that I've never seen any policymaker go into, saying what is the value of this. It's just it's like it has infinite value, and everybody should have it, even though it costs $250,000 to run a wire, and then I've got to talk them into it. So, I mean, it's kind of crazy.
Our time is about up. I will, I guess, Larry, do we have time for a couple questions?
Sure, that's a great, wonderful.
Okay. Any questions of the panel?
We don't have to handle my.
Larry, yes.
Oh, we do, excuse me.
Okay. Sorry. I can bring it to you.
Questions? Oh,
We've now seen on the website of the Trump president-elect that he's thinking that Telecoms should be part of the infrastructure initiative. I'm interested in, from you all, whether you think that's something that should be included, and if so, what would that mean?
Well, we've done it before, and I would dare to venture we probably wasted close to $7 billion. It just depends, on how it gets done. I think that if you do believe, like I say, if there's this externality in there and you think that government money needs to be in it, then okay, you made a decision that I've got to subsidize this to get the quantity that I want. But then you got to get down to the nitty-gritty of how you plan to do it. And my confidence level in government's ability to spend money wisely is very, very low. But on the other hand, the infrastructure thing is, we're lagging behind on that, but we're also $22 trillion in debt, at least, maybe more than that now. So, I don't know. If you think there's an externality issue and a deployment gap, then subsidies is a solution to that.
My guess, and I don't claim to be a huge expert on this, is that if you want to spend money on infrastructure, that's probably not the best place to do it for a couple of reasons. One is that if you think that there's an employment basis for infrastructure investment, that's probably not where the thing that's best suited for the people who aren't working, who might be able to work on a job involving infrastructure. Construction. The other thing is that part of the reasons that both John and George alluded to, you know, I think of the infrastructure shortfall is basically maintaining, you know, the big old clunky stuff, you know, like fixing water mains, fixing bridges, you know, stuff like that, as opposed to, you know, we've done it, as John's reported, you know, done a pretty good job building out broadband, so I'm not exactly sure that if I was going to spend money on infrastructure support, both for reasons of, is that where the right, would that have the right employment effect, and is that where the need is the greatest, I would put telecom pretty far down below a lot of other things that we put in the infrastructure line.
So I like the idea of having a world-class infrastructure. I think both candidates were right in emphasizing the need for infrastructure investments in the U.S. economy. I agree with Tim that from a personal perspective, my sense is that when the candidates were at least initially talking about infrastructure, what the highest priorities were in the traditional areas of roads, bridges, airports, and so on. It doesn't mean that telecom is not important. It is important. But I'd go back to my earlier caveat and say, if we're going to do it, if we're going to be in the infrastructure enhancing business, either on the deployment side or on the adoption side, let's be smart about it. Let's find out what the levers are that we can smartly pull to get people to increase their adoption rates, and what we might smartly do to get broadband service deployed to those folks who, as George speaks to, are very expensive to serve with traditional means of broadband. So let's be smart about it if we're going to do it.
I think too, you could probably have, rather than throw money at the problem, is try to have some coordination requirements in there with telecom infrastructure deployment and road construction or whatever it is, so that if you are going to do something, everybody gets notified and it's easy to get permitting and you can run cables. And I've had, through my work with the Broadband Task Force, we've had cases where you literally have a business across the street from a piece of fiber and you can't get across the street. I mean, it's no further than that wall back there, and you can't cross the street. But you also have to have sympathy for the departments of transportation, because you know they have to maintain their things, and the companies are attached to their stuff, and there's whose fault is it if something goes bad, or if I have to paint it, you know, are you going to come take your stuff off so I can paint? I mean, there's like all these little pieces. But I mean, I agree with Tim. I mean, we got bigger fish to fry. The private sector has proven itself more than willing to invest in this type of infrastructure. We might facilitate, ease it up a little bit. We might get some incremental gain in deployment. Probably not a huge effect, but maybe a little bit of an effect that might be helpful. That'd be useful.
Time for one more question there.
Okay, I was going to sort of jump on, but I given time constraints. All right, why don't we take a